My name is Daniel Okafor. I am 36 years old. I am standing in my sister's kitchen in Cedar Falls, Iowa, holding a mug of coffee that's gone lukewarm, listening to her rehearse a sentence she's going to say to our entire family in about 40 minutes. She's said it 4 times already, adjusting the emphasis like she's tuning an instrument. My boss, she says, wiping down a countertop that's already clean, founded Nexora. He built it from nothing. He's coming tonight, so everyone needs to be normal. Okay? Normal. She looks at me last. Longest look of the 4. That means you too, Daniel. I didn't say anything. I picked up a dish towel and started drying the good glasses, the ones our mother only brings out twice a year, and I let her finish saying what she needed to say. That's usually the fastest way through a conversation like this one. You let people finish. You don't interrupt the part where they're building the version of you they need to believe in. But I want to tell you how we got to this kitchen on this particular December evening, because it didn't start here. It started 9 years ago, in a different kitchen on a Sunday afternoon when my sister Priya told our parents I'd settled for logistics work, and our mother nodded like that settled something. I'm the middle child. Priya is 2 years older. Our younger brother Marcus lives in Denver and mostly stays out of the family gravity well, which I've always respected him for. Priya was the daughter who did everything in the correct order. Good grades, state school, business degree, unpaid internship that turned into a real job, promotion. By the time she was 28, she had a title with the word senior in it and a LinkedIn profile she updated more often than she called our mother. I did not do everything in the correct order. I dropped out of a computer science program at 20 after 2 brutal years, not because I couldn't do the work, but because I'd started building something on the side, inventory routing software, the unglamorous kind, the kind that tells warehouses which truck goes where and when, and I couldn't do both at once, and the thing I was building felt more real to me than the degree. My parents did not see it that way. My father, a pharmacist who believes there are exactly 3 respectable outcomes for a life, doctor, engineer, or something adjacent enough to pass, took it as a personal failure. My mother took it as a story she'd now have to manage at church. I remember the exact Sunday it calcified into fact. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, the kind of gray Iowa afternoon where the light never really commits to being daylight, and we were all still sitting around the dining table an hour after the food was gone, the way our family does when nobody wants to be the one who breaks up the gathering. Priya had just gotten a promotion, her second in 18 months, and she'd announced it the way she announced everything mid-bite, like the timing itself was part of the achievement. My mother clapped. My father asked about the salary, which he does with Priya, and never once did with me. And then my mother turned to me, still smiling from Priya's news, and asked what I was up to these days. I told her, plainly, that I was building software for a logistics startup, that we'd just signed our 4th client, that it was slow, but it was real. She nodded the way you nod at a child describing a dream they had. That's nice, she said. As long as you're doing something. For the next several years, whenever the subject of my work came up at a family gathering, my mother would say, in a voice pitched exactly for other people to hear, Daniel does something with trucks. That was the whole sentence. Does something with trucks. It wasn't cruel, exactly. It was worse than cruel, in a way, because it was said with a kind of resigned affection, like she was talking about a dog that never quite got housebroken but that the family loved anyway. I let it go. I let it go so many times that letting it go became a kind of muscle memory, a reflex faster than the sting itself. I reached for the bread basket instead. That's what I usually did. Some detail to occupy my hands while the sentence passed through the room and settled somewhere behind my sternum. Meanwhile, the actual truth of what I did with trucks was this. The routing software I'd built in a dorm room and then a garage and then a rented office above a tire shop in Fremont had, over 9 years, become the backbone system for a supply chain platform used by 14 mid-sized logistics companies across the West Coast. I wasn't rich in the way people picture rich. I drove a 6-year-old Honda. I rented, I didn't own. But the company I'd co-founded had been quietly, steadily profitable for 4 years, and profitability in that world gets you noticed by people who fund things. One of the people who noticed, back when my company was 2 guys and a spreadsheet, was a 26-year-old engineer who just left a failed startup and was circling a new idea about warehouse automation. He didn't have money then. He had conviction, and a whiteboard covered in diagrams nobody else believed in yet. And he needed someone who understood freight logistics well enough to tell him whether his idea was physics or fantasy. I told him it was physics. I spent 6 unpaid weekends helping him model it. When he raised his seed round 18 months later, he asked me to join his board as an advisor, not for equity theater, but because I was one of maybe 4 people on the West Coast who actually understood both the software and the loading dock at the same time. That company is called Nexora. The engineer's name is Marcus Chen. I still remember the smell of that Fremont office in the early days, burned drip coffee, and the faint ozone smell of too many space heaters running off one circuit, because the building's landlord wouldn't fix the thermostat until the third-floor tenants threatened to break the lease. Marcus and I would sit on the floor with a whiteboard between us, arguing about throughput models until 2 in the morning, and I'd drive home along 880 with the windows down just to stay awake, thinking that whatever this was, it felt more like my actual life than anything I'd done trying to satisfy the version of myself my parents wanted. I have sat across a conference table from Marcus Chen every quarter for 6 years. I have watched Nexora grow from 12 employees crammed into that same Fremont building, 2 floors below my own office, as it happens for the first 18 months, into a company with 340 employees and a valuation that gets reported in the trade press with a comma and 6 zeros after it. And for 6 years, my family had absolutely no idea because I never told them, and because the version of me my mother had already built didn't have room for it. I want to be precise about why I never corrected the record. It wasn't modesty, and it wasn't strategy, not at first. It was exhaustion. Correcting my mother's story about me had never once worked. I'd tried in my 20s a handful of times, mentioned the company, mentioned a deal, mentioned a number, and watched the information simply not land, deflected by a story that had already been written and filed. "That's nice, sweetheart," she'd say, and turn back to whatever Priya had just announced. After enough of those, you stop offering the correction. Not because you've made peace with the story, because you've learned the story isn't actually about facts. It's about a role someone assigned you before you were old enough to argue, and some families never update the casting. So I stopped bringing it up. I built my life quietly, 2 hours south of where my parents lived, and I came home for the holidays, and I let my mother tell people I did something with trucks, and I ate the turkey, and I drove back to Fremont on the 27th feeling like I'd survived something rather than enjoyed something. Our brother Marcus, a different Marcus, and yes, the coincidence of the name became genuinely funny to me later, though it wasn't funny yet, had actually met the real Marcus Chen once, briefly, at a conference 2 years earlier, and mentioned to me afterward that Priya's new boss seemed sharp. I hadn't put it together either, not fully, not until the messages started arriving that December. Some part of me assumes now that I could have pieced it together sooner if I'd been paying closer attention to my sister's stories instead of tuning them out the way I'd trained myself to. But I'd stopped listening carefully to Priya's work stories years earlier, the same way she'd stopped listening to mine, a mutual, unspoken agreement that neither of our professional lives were really up for discussion at family dinners. Priya, meanwhile, had spent the last 11 months at Nexora, hired into a mid-level operations role after her previous company did layoffs, and had discovered, sometime around September, that her CEO occasionally attended board meetings with a man named Daniel. She never made the connection. There are a lot of Daniels in the Bay Area. And she'd only ever met me at family events, in jeans, saying almost nothing. What she had made a connection to, thoroughly and enthusiastically, was the fact that she now worked for a company whose founder was, in her words to our mother over Thanksgiving, basically a legend. She had learned to say Marcus Chen's name the way other people say the names of saints. She'd started mentioning him in every conversation, unprompted, the way you'd mention a landmark you now lived near. My boss. My boss built this from a garage. My boss turned down 2 acquisition offers because he believes in the mission. It was 6:14 on a Tuesday evening in early December when I got the text from her that started this. I remember the time because I was standing in the Nexora building's lobby, waiting for an elevator after a board dinner, checking my phone. Priya. Guess who's coming to Christmas this year? Marcus Chen is doing a whole thing where execs visit employees' hometowns for the holidays. It's a company culture initiative. He picked me. He's coming to Cedar Falls. Do not tell Mom yet, I want to surprise her. I read it twice. Then I put my phone away and got in the elevator because at that exact moment, 6 floors up in a conference room with a view of the Fremont Hills, Marcus Chin was signing off on that exact culture initiative, a program he genuinely committed to, visiting a handful of employees' families over the holidays, no cameras, no PR team, because he believed in it and because he was, underneath the valuation and the trade press, still the 26-year-old who used to eat cold pizza at my kitchen table while we argued about routing algorithms. I did not know that Tuesday that his list included Cedar Falls, Iowa. I did not know it included my sister. I found out 3 days later, the way you find out most important things in a family, by accident, in a group text, my mother forwarding a message with 11 exclamation points about Priya's boss coming to Christmas dinner. I sat with that information for a long moment. Then I texted Marcus directly. Tell me you're not doing the family visit thing at a house in Cedar Falls this year. Asterisk Marcus. I am, actually. Small team, big year, thought it'd mean something. Why, asterisk. Asterisk me. Because that's my sister's house. Priya is my sister. Asterisk. There was a pause long enough that I could picture him actually standing up from his desk. Asterisk Marcus. Wait. Priya Okafor is your sister, asterisk. Me, yes. Asterisk Marcus. She has never once mentioned you. Not once. I've heard about your family maybe 4 times, and it was always some story about her brother, who works in a warehouse and never amounted to much, asterisk. I looked at that message for a while. Not with anger. With something quieter and more clarifying. The sensation of a picture finally resolving into focus after years of being slightly blurred. I'd known in the abstract that this was probably the story my mother told. I hadn't known it had traveled this specifically, or this far, or landed in the one room in the world where it would eventually collide with the truth. Asterisk me. Don't tell her. I want to see something. Asterisk. Asterisk Marcus. Daniel. This is either the best or worst idea you've ever had. Asterisk. Asterisk me. Probably both. Still come. Asterisk. In the weeks before I flew home, I found myself replaying a specific memory more than once. A Thanksgiving 4 years earlier, when Priya had gone around the table asking everyone to share one thing you're proud of this year. When it got to me, I'd said, honestly, that we'd just closed our best quarter yet at the company. My mother had smiled politely and moved the question to my cousin before I'd finished the sentence. I hadn't pushed it. I never pushed it. There's a particular kind of fatigue that sets in after. Enough of those moments. Not anger, just a slow recalibration of how much of yourself you bother bringing to a room that's already decided it isn't listening. I'd gotten so used to that recalibration that I almost didn't recognize, standing in my apartment packing a bag for Iowa, that this year might be different. I didn't plan anything elaborate. I didn't rehearse a single line, unlike my sister 3 states away rehearsing hers into a kitchen towel. I just packed my bag, texted Marcus one more time to confirm his flight, and let a decision I'd made unconsciously years ago, to stop correcting the record, finally reach its natural, quiet end. I flew home on December 22nd. I told my parents I'd be there, same as every year, no additional information volunteered. I did not tell Priya that I knew who was coming. I did not tell her what I did for a living because at this point that would have required unwinding 6 years of silence in a phone call, and some things are better shown than explained. The week leading up to Christmas Eve, I stood in my sister's kitchen and dried glasses and listened to her rehearse. I want to be honest about what I felt in that kitchen because it wasn't triumph, not yet. It was a kind of tired sadness, watching someone I loved build a moment on a foundation she didn't know was about to give out from under her. I almost pulled her aside and told her right then, save her the version of this that was coming. I didn't. Some part of me, the part that had spent 9 years absorbing, does something with trucks, without correction, needed the room to see it happen in real time. Not out of cruelty. Out of a need, finally, for the story to be told accurately once, in front of everyone who'd helped write the wrong version. You'll be polite tonight, right? Priya asked me, folding a napkin into a shape it did not want to hold. This is a big deal for my career. I need this to go well. I'll be polite, I said. I meant it. I had no plans to say a single unkind word to her all evening. I didn't need to. Just don't make it weird. Don't talk about, Trucks. If he asks what you do, just say logistics and leave it there. Logistics, I repeated. Got it. That was, in fact, true. It just wasn't the whole sentence. The house filled up around 6. My father in the good sweater he wears exactly twice a year. My mother moving through the living room refilling drinks nobody asked to have refilled, narrating the evening to herself the way she does when she's nervous. The roast needs 15 more minutes, Marcus. Is it Marcus? I hope I'm saying it right. Marcus, our cousin's husband, corrected her twice, thinking she meant him. At 6:52, the doorbell rang. Priya's face did something I want to describe carefully because it's the last moment of the evening that belonged fully to the story she'd built. It was pure, unguarded joy, the joy of someone about to be seen, finally, in the exact way she'd always wanted to be seen. She practically ran to the door. "Everyone," she said, pulling it open, "this is..." Marcus Chin stepped into the doorway in a plain gray coat, stomping snow off his boots, smiling the easy smile he uses with new investors and nervous engineers alike. He looked past Priya first, the way people do when they're taking in a room. And then his eyes moved past the crowd of relatives, past my mother frozen mid-sentence with a wine bottle in her hand, and landed on me. He stopped stomping his boots. "Daniel?" The room did the thing rooms do when a word lands wrong, a half-second of silence before anyone understands why it's wrong. Marcus looked at Priya, then back at me, genuinely working it out in real time, even though I'd told him 3 weeks ago. He's a good actor when he wants to be, and he wanted to be, tonight for my sake. "You're her brother?" I didn't answer right away. I set down the glass I was holding instead. My Aunt Colleen, who has never in her life let an awkward silence go unfilled, let out a short, nervous laugh. "Well," she said, "isn't that just the smallest world?" Nobody moved. Everyone in that entryway wanted to hear what came next, even the ones pretending they were still taking off their coats. Marcus turned to Priya, and his voice wasn't performative anymore. This part was real because he actually was confused about something. "You said he worked warehouse." Priya's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it for a second. "He's on my board," Marcus said, to the room now, still not quite believing the geometry of it. "Daniel's been on Nexora's board for 6 years. He's the reason the routing system works at all. Half the reason I have a company." I want to tell you what my sister's face did because I've thought about it a lot since. It wasn't shock exactly. Shock would have been simpler. It was the specific, slow collapse of a story meeting a fact it couldn't survive contact with, the visible internal work of trying to hold 2 irreconcilable Daniels in her head at once, the one she'd spent 9 years describing, and the one currently standing in her mother's kitchen being greeted by name by the most important person she'd ever tried to impress. Priya went pale. Genuinely pale, the color leaving her face in a way I'd never seen before, not at any funeral, not at any fight. "I didn't," she started. "I thought." "You thought what?" Marcus asked, not cruelly, genuinely curious, the way he gets when a data point contradicts a model. Priya didn't answer. My mother, wine bottle still in hand, said the only thing she could manage. "Daniel, you never told us you knew Marcus." "I never told you a lot of things," I said. "You never asked in a way that made it seem worth telling." I want to note, for the record, that I said that quietly. I didn't raise my voice. I've never raised my voice at my family in my life, and I wasn't going to start over a doorway in Cedar Falls. There was no need. The facts were doing all the necessary work by themselves. Priya said she needed a minute and went into the kitchen, ostensibly to check on a side dish that did not need checking. I let her have the minute. I've learned over the years that following someone into a moment like that rarely helps either person. It just moves the discomfort somewhere more private without actually resolving it. Dinner did not go the way Priya had rehearsed it in the kitchen. Marcus, to his credit, treated it like any other evening. He asked my father about his pharmacy, complimented my mother's roast twice, unprompted, and spent a good 20 minutes describing, at my niece's insistence, exactly how a self-driving forklift decides which pallet to grab first. He is, underneath the valuation, still a person who likes explaining things to people who are curious. But every so often the conversation would circle back, The way conversations do at a table that's just absorbed a structural shock, and each time it circled back to me. "So, how long have you two known each other?" my father asked, halfway through the meal, still working out the timeline. 6 years, Marcus said. Daniel helped me model the entire routing engine before I had a single employee. I used to sleep on his office floor because I couldn't afford an apartment in Fremont yet. He does something with trucks, my mother said. It came out automatically, the sentence her mouth had said so many times it no longer required her permission. He built the system that tells the trucks where to go, Marcus said, gently, like he was correcting a typo rather than 9 years of family record. There's a difference. At one point, my cousin Rosa, who works in nursing and has never had much patience for family theater, leaned over and asked me directly, "Wait, so how much of the company do you actually own?" It was the kind of blunt question nobody else at the table would have asked out loud, and I appreciated her for it. "Enough that I don't worry about it," I said, and left it there, because the number itself was never the point. Rosa nodded slowly, like she was recalibrating something, and went back to her plate, but I noticed she kept glancing at me for the rest of the meal with a kind of quiet, reassessing curiosity, the first time anyone at that table had looked at me that way. Priya sat through most of this without speaking, moving food around her plate. I watched her do the math I'd been doing for 9 years in reverse. Every story she'd told at this table about her brilliant boss, every comparison she'd drawn between her ascending career and my stalled one, every time she'd asked our parents, in front of me, whether I was doing okay career-wise, in the specific tone reserved for people you've already decided to feel sorry for. At one point, she looked at me directly and said, quietly, under the noise of the table, "Why didn't you just tell me?" "I tried a few times years ago," I said. You changed the subject before I finished the sentence. After a while, I stopped finishing it. She didn't have an answer for that. I didn't need her to have one. The cascade, once it started, didn't stop at dinner. Before Marcus left that night, around 9:40, he found me alone by the coat rack and said something I've held on to since. "Your family built their whole picture of you on information that stopped being true about 6 years ago," he said, zipping his coat. "That's not really your fault. But it's not really a mystery either, once you say it out loud like that." He shook my hand, told my mother the roast was the best he'd had all year, which she repeated to 3 separate relatives before he'd even reached his car, and left for his hotel. I stood on the porch and watched his taillights go down the street, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the specific tiredness that usually followed a family gathering. I felt something closer to quiet. 2 days later, my mother called me, not to apologize, not exactly, but to ask, with a carefulness I'd never heard from her before, whether I would be willing to talk to her book club about what I actually did, because apparently one of the other members had a son trying to get into tech, and my mother wanted, for the first time in my adult life, to be the parent with something useful to offer. A week after that, my father asked me, over the phone, whether the pharmacy's supplier contracts, which had been costing him money on inefficient delivery windows for years, could be run through anything like what I'd built. I spent 40 minutes on the phone walking him through it, and for the first time since I was 19 years old, I heard something in his voice that wasn't disappointment. Priya took the longest. She didn't call for 3 weeks. When she finally did, it wasn't an apology exactly, either. It was an admission, delivered slowly, like she was setting down something heavy she'd been carrying without noticing the weight. "I think I needed you to be the one who didn't make it," she said. I don't know why. It made mine feel bigger. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window instead. "I'm not saying that to excuse it," she added. "I'm saying it because I think it's true, and I've never said it out loud before." I told her I appreciated that. I meant it. I didn't tell her it was fine because it wasn't entirely fine, and I've learned that pretending it is doesn't actually close the distance, it just papers over it until the next holiday. What I told her instead was that I'd be at the pharmacy contract call if she wanted to sit in, since it affected the whole family's business, and she could ask me anything she wanted about the last 9 years, and I'd actually answer this time. She came to that call. She asked a lot of questions. It was a start. My mother, for her part, stopped saying the truck's sentence entirely, not with any grand announcement, just a quiet retirement of a line that no longer fit the facts. In its place, At the next family gathering, she introduced me to a neighbor as my son who's on the board of a technology company, which was clumsy and slightly wrong, and still the single most accurate thing she'd said about my career in a decade. I let it stand. Some corrections don't need to be perfect. They just need to be honest. I want to tell you something, because I think it matters beyond this one Christmas. There's a particular kind of quiet that happens inside families. Not the loud kind, not the shouting kind, but the administrative kind, where someone decides early on who you are, and then everyone around them simply adopts the ruling without revisiting it, year after year, holiday after holiday, until the story becomes furniture. Nobody has to be cruel for this to happen. My mother wasn't cruel. She was tired and busy, and it was easier to say, does something with trucks, than to ask a follow-up question. She didn't have room for that day. My sister wasn't cruel either, not really. She was building her own identity against a shape she needed me to hold still for. But easier isn't the same as true, and the people who build their comfort on a story about you that stopped being accurate years ago do not, generally, recover well from finding out. Not because they're bad people. Because the story was load-bearing, and nobody warns you what happens to a house when you remove a wall it turns out was never actually holding anything up. Setting a boundary, or in my case, simply letting a room discover the truth without managing it for them, is not an attack. It's information. When you stop performing this smaller version of yourself that made everyone else's story make sense, you're not being cruel to them. You're teaching them, often for the first time, where the actual edges of you are. You can love people who dismissed you and still refuse to keep playing the part they assigned you. Love isn't a blank check written against your own shrinking. It never was, and it took me a long time to stop feeling guilty about that. I think about how easy it would have been to correct my mother the first time she said, does something with trucks, to pull out my phone and show her a contract or a headline and demand she update the record on the spot. I didn't, and for years I told myself that was patience. Looking back, I think it was also fear. The fear that even with the proof in front of her, the story wouldn't move, and I'd have to sit with the fact that the correction itself didn't matter to her as much as I needed it to. What finally worked wasn't a better argument. It was simply time and truth, arriving on their own schedule, in a doorway neither of us had planned for. The people who chose to see you really see you before anything was proven, before there was a founder in the doorway to settle the argument for you. Those people are more your family, in the ways that matter, than blood alone can guarantee. Marcus Chin slept on my office floor when neither of us had anything. He knew who I was in a way my own mother hadn't gotten around to asking about in 9 years. Biology is a fact. Being known is a choice, and some people make it and some people don't, and you're allowed to notice the difference. I'm not going to tell you I walked away from my family because I didn't, and I don't think that's the lesson here. What I'll tell you is that I stopped performing smallness for a room that had decided smallness was who I was, and the room adjusted, slowly, imperfectly, because it had to. That adjustment is not bitterness. It's just what happens when the truth finally gets a turn to speak. And the quiet that came after, the version of this family where nobody needs to say he does something with trucks anymore, where my father calls to ask real questions instead of managing disappointment, where my sister sits in on a call instead of narrating a story about me to people who've never met me. That quiet is an emptiness. That's what it was supposed to sound like all along. Priya said, my boss is a Silicon Valley founder, because she thought that sentence made her the most impressive person in the family, once and for all. She never imagined that the same sentence would be the one that finally introduced everyone at that table to who her brother actually was. Tell me honestly, if you'd been standing in that kitchen, drying glasses while someone rehearsed a story that erased you, would you have corrected it years ago? Or would you have waited, the way I did, for the truth to walk in on its own and introduce itself? The story you just heard was inspired by real experiences shared on public platforms including Reddit and other online communities. It has been thoughtfully adapted and reimagined for storytelling purposes. All characters, situations, names, and settings are fictional, altered, or generated using AI tools. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is entirely coincidental and unintentional. This story was created to deliver positive messages, emotional insight, and meaningful reflection, not to represent or defame any real person or situation.